Hey, George, you're a scientist.
I'm a chemist, yes.
Yeah, right. You're a scientist. So, why can wool keep you like warm and cozy in the winter, but also like kind of cool in the summer? Because like I have some like wool stuff that is summer stuff, which feels like it's not. I can't wear a sweater in the summer. Like what's going on? Why how por qué how dos?
Well, darn it, Lions. I'm a chemist, not a clothing scientist, because those are a thing. With my very limited knowledge and very limited area of expertise, I will attempt to opine to this. And I will say that this is one thing that you've said to me a couple of times. You're like, yeah, wool, it can keep you warm and cool. And like every time you said it, I was like, I don't have enough information to refute that, but that can't be right. Like
It
so
feels
I'm
wrong.
right? Yeah. And so I was just like, but I'll shut up. Lions is really excited about this wool thing he's showing me. So I'll just, kind of keep this crap to myself. And so when this one came up in the list, I was like, all right, let's do this. And you're right. I mean, it does do both. And it still feels wrong, but actually the way that it does it is wild to me. So first, let's talk about how does wool keep you warm? Let's start there. So, first of all, so we've reviewed this before, right? How is heat transferred between objects?
You got conduction, you got convection, you got
Yep.
radiation.
There you go, man. You got the three. And I remember in one of the other episodes, you're like, I have a small existential crisis every time you ask me something we've gone over.
Yeah, no, actually, coincidentally, I re-listened to that episode recently, and just even hearing myself say that kind of triggered that feeling.
Yes, that is accurate. And the interesting thing is that there is actually a formula for the transference of heat via conduction, which I think is kind of cool. It's Q, which is the heat supplied into the system, equals to M, the mass of the system, times delta T, which is the change in temperature of the system, right? And then C, which is the specific heat capacity of the system, right? So basically, the moral of the story is that the reason why I say all that is to say that due to wool's structure, it does not have a lot of surface area contact with you, right? And because of that, it doesn't do a good job drawing heat out of your system, right? So one of the things that determines how much heat is being...
Because it's like loopy. It's sort of like a spongy...
Exactly.
Yeah, like lots of tight loops with air, I guess. Lots of air pockets.
You got it, right? So one of the functionalities of what determines how much heat gets pulled away from you is the surface area of the area of contact, right? So, and that kind of makes sense, right? If you have a lot of surface area touching a thing, if you put your finger on a thing, it's going to suck less heat out of you than if you put your whole hand on it, right? The other thing that is a part of that function is like, what is the delta temperature, right? So if you got a really hot thing and a really cold thing, the heat will transfer between the two way faster than if you've got a mildly hot thing and a mildly cold thing, right? So there's a bunch of different things that will determine how well it conducts heat, but there's also basically a coefficient of heat, right? Sorry, I just said it. A coefficient of heat transfer, right? And then that also impacts it, right? So because of the structure of the thing, it just does not pull a lot of heat out of you, which is part of why it keeps you warm. So like leather, which lays flat on your whatever, right, pulls a lot of heat out of you because a lot of it is touching you. So whatever temperature it is, your body is really working hard to make it those two things the same temperature. Does that kind of make sense?
It does, and you're also making me... I mean, they're different materials, so I know they have like different performance characteristics, but I have tried to explain to people who do not live in the mountains when they come to visit the mountains, like, oh, like the materials you're wearing matters. If you put on like a cotton sweater and then a cotton hoodie, you will not be warmer. You will just be wearing two things made out of cotton. And like most cotton clothing is like a tighter weave that would lay flat against you. And so then if you layer something cotton over it, all of that cotton is pressed directly against the underlying cotton, right? So if you actually wore like a baggy sweater that didn't fit you and that had like an air pocket in it, it might perform better.
Yes, yeah, and there's obviously a whole lot of science that kind of goes into that stuff, but yeah, there are definitely some materials that just inherently do a better job at keeping your core temperature inside your body, right? one of the interesting things is that, like, for example, does a breeze feel cool typically?
Well, if it's on your skin, I guess it'd be wicking like moisture off.
Possibly, yeah. To a degree, but the main
it's moving the warm air close to you away faster.
Correct. Right. So the warm air that is your aura of warm air, your Super Saiyan aura of warm air that you keep around you, right, is being pushed away, which is interesting because it is actually possible for the heat outside to be so hot that it is hotter than the aura of warmth, in which case then if you blow air on somebody, you will actually overheat them, which is wild.
I learned about that during the heat wave last summer, maybe, where people were like, oh man, I got this fan turned on and it's not helping. And it's like, no, it is actually hurting you a lot.
Yep. Yeah. It's making it way worse. Yes. So all of that, right? So basically it does a good job not basically touching you without touching you, right? So it allows you to keep all that. So that's part of what makes it warm. Additionally, it adsorbs water. Now you'll note that I did not say it absorbs water. Do you know the difference between adsorption and absorption?
I'm gonna guess opposites, and here's why. One, science has to have a goddamn complicated word for everything, and you couldn't just say it wicks away moisture, right?
Right.
And two, I spent a very brief part of my young life as like a trainer in a gym. And part of my training to get that job was to learn like the muscular system, and your hip adductors bring your legs together. It adds your legs together, and your hip abductors, ABD, pulls them apart. Right. So one pulls your knees further away from each other, and the other one pushes your knees closer to each other. That's how I remember it. I sure hope that's right, since I just had that fun anecdote, though.
You're close. They are opposites in a way, you know?
I'll take it.
Yeah. Well, there is a part of their functionality that is opposite. So I'm going to tell you the first thing, and you're going to go, aw, and I'm going to tell you the second thing, and you're going to say, see, I told you, George. So things are, a thing absorbs another thing if the entire material is absorbing it. So for example, when you dump salt into water, the water absorbs the salt, right? Adsorption is when it just happens on the surface of the thing, right? So like, for example, if I were to be sweating and I were to take a rag and press it to my head, my sweat would get adsorbed by the cloth. It would not get absorbed because it doesn't go into the whole thing. It just goes onto the surface.
This is a science words, and the words of a human macro scale don't work well together. So when you say goes into the surface, you mean when you like wipe sweat off your forehead, that the sweat has not like gone into the like chemical fibers of the thing. It is just sitting on the surface of them.
Correct. And then
right.
and then it gets
the salt actually
by
like
the
bonds
surface
into the water.
Well,
So
and that's the
actually
thing is that like
absorbed.
Well, a way to think about it is it's not just the surface area that's doing the work,
Yeah.
right? You know, it's the volume. So it's like it more matters like the volume of the thing as opposed to the surface area of the thing, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
So here's where they're opposites. Adsorption tends to be exothermic. Absorption tends to be endothermic. So they are opposites. Ta-da!
Yay.
You did it.
Close enough.
Yeah. So it is safe to say that wool deals with adsorption, not absorption, right? Because it's obviously going onto the surface area of the wool. The wool's not just like sucking up the whole thing and leaving you a desiccated husk. So basically, as you're kind of walking around and just existing in the world, right, you exude moisture, right? So that moisture then gets captured by the wool through adsorption, which is exothermic, which then releases a not insubstantial amount of heat. So by
is
basically,
that because it gets spread out over the surface area? Like, what makes it lose heat?
So what makes adsorption exothermic, which means it gives off heat, right? So So honestly, entropy. I don't know.
Science. I don't know.
Yeah, science, man. What am I, scientist? No, so it's just one of those things that like you just like you learn where it's just like, hey, and not all of them are, but they tend to be, you know. And so it's just like, hey, if you're dealing with the adsorption of a thing and you're looking at the amount of heat that is released from the system, double check, make sure that that number is positive to make sure you didn't screw it up, right? You know, like and so on and so forth. It's one of those things where I'm like, I am sure that there is some like crazy calculus equation with deltas and all sorts of stuff that says like, and that's why, you know, that's why tea is worth $50 in France, you know, like, or whatever crazy thing it proves, you know. But adsorption tends to be exothermic. I do not know why. So as you exude general moisture that your body releases kind of all the time, it causes it to adsorb onto the material and warm you up, right? So it continues to radiate that warmth, right? So it basically, by virtue of you being a human and sweating a little bit all of the time, right? It kind of turns the thing into like a thermal heater almost, right?
All right. Cool. Yeah. So a few minutes ago, I felt like I think maybe I'm starting to see how it could do warmth and cold, and now I feel less sure because I feel less sure how that would then map to cooling you.
Right. And so that was the thing. It's like, okay, I got the warm thing down, but then how does it keep you cool, right? So so let's talk about how does wool keep you cool, right? So you're now all toasty warm in your wool. Now you're too warmer. It's hot, too hot. What's going to happen, right? You're going to continue to sweat, right? You know, so that is a thing. But the wool will eventually hit like its kind of its upper threshold of like how much it's going to adsorb, right? And then as you continue to get warm, well, I mean, why do we sweat in the first place?
To shed heat mostly.
Right, but how do we shed heat through? Yes, but how do we shed heat through sweating?
So like, you picture like forearm, right? So the sweat beads up on your forearm, and then if it's exposed to the air, because you're like a naked humanoid out on the Serengeti, the wind would then wick the moisture away, which would take the heat with it.
Right. So basically, even if there is no wind, right, no breeze,
it would still evaporate.
Yeah, it evaporates because basically, and that's the thing is that like there is actually something called the heat of vaporization. So the simple act of something evaporating takes heat, right? It pulls heat out of the system, right? So as your body temperature is X, right? As it continues to just pour energy into the water and the water starts to evaporate, it takes that energy off into the atmosphere. It takes it away from you, right? So that's how that works. The wool effectively does that, right? So because by evaporating the moisture that is on the wool, right, it would have a cooling effect on the body, right? Because all of that energy that you're pouring into the wool in order to get the moisture to evaporate gets wicked away, right? It's pulled away from you. So what that means is that as your body temperature continues to increase, eventually it hits a point to where it starts to evaporate the water that's on the wool already, and that has a cooling effect. So basically what it does is as you get colder, the water doesn't evaporate, it adsorbs, which generates heat. And then as it starts to generate too much heat and you get warmer and warmer, it then generates enough heat for it to start to evaporate, which then has a cooling effect. So it literally keeps you oscillating between those two things kind of constantly, which is like a weird like biomechanical energy converter, which I think is like really cool, and warm apparently.
Excellent job. So I'm right as you were kind of talking about that oscillation, that made me realize like it keeps us warm because that is the part of the work getting done that we care about. And it keeps us cool because that is the part of the work getting done that we care about. But really it's that it has a stabilization range where the processes flip. That is
right.
The magic part, right? Because
exactly.
Otherwise you would have to do something externally to say, now be hot, now be cold, right? But because the way the material functions physics, it is oscillating in a range that happens to also be like convenient for humans. Because maybe like it wouldn't generate enough warmth for like a reptile, right? If you like wrapped a reptile in wool, like that wouldn't be useful for them because they don't generate a lot of heat. So maybe it would actually be negative for certain creatures. But like for us, we're right in that happy kind of like Goldilocks zone.
Homeostasis.
Yeah.
Homeostasis, yeah.
Oh, thanks, sheep. Thanks for evolving a material that happens to work so well for us.
Well, and I might be wrong on this because God knows I'm not a biologist, but I'm curious what percentage of mammalian life actually maintains a homeostatic temperature around where we do, plus or minus a couple of degrees. Because my understanding of the reason why it's so important that we have like we're 98.6 plus or minus like kind of 2 to 4 degrees, and then it starts to get Fahrenheit, which is like 1 or 2 degrees in the real world. Is like it actually starts to become an issue because a lot of the proteins that allow us to human denature at certain temperatures, right? So like they're coiled up in a very specific configuration that's really important. If they get too hot, they kind of, and kind of,
which I believe is a scientific term.
Yes, yeah, it's weird. It's PBTTTT. Some people throw a fifth T on the end of it, but don't listen to them. That's English standard, not metric.
Charlatans.
But it's also similar to the idea of how familiar are you with buffer solutions?
I mean, as always, tremendously. But
yes,
there are probably some people listening who aren't. So if you would,
yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that is kind of cool is that like, if you add like a weak acid and a weak base to like a water, right? You will tend to create a buffer solution. And it has been a while since I studied this in chemistry, so God, don't at me. But anyways, you will create a buffer solution, which then means that if you add more acid, right, it won't proportionally decrease the pH because the base kind of gets to work at neutralizing it. And the same thing for if you add more base, it doesn't, proportionally decrease it because there's a lot of acid in there, right? So if you add those two things together, if you add a little bit more of one or the other, it continues to keep it at a somewhat neutral pH or whatever pH you've buffered it at, which is really helpful because then what you can do is you can create a buffer solution where you're like, I want this to be a pH of 3 and I want it to kind of stay a pH of 3. I want it to be pretty robust. You can add a whole bunch of acid and base in there to keep it stable at pH of 3. So even if some acidic things come in there, the pH isn't going to immediately fall out, right? Until it like absorbs the buffer solution. It's kind of like that, but for temperature, right? Is that like, it's made so that way, like, hey, when you get hot, once you get to a certain point of hot, it then kind of like kicks in and starts to say like, no, come back down to normal. And then when you start to get too cold, it's like, okay, now bring it back up. And it just kind of, keeps that oscillation around a mean, which I honestly believe, since we get it from sheep, is probably around the same temperature that they need to be at. And that's why it works so well for them.
I think you're probably right on the back of this one silly anecdote, which is if you ever watch like Tierzoo or Discovery Channel,
oh, yeah.
or you read, any kind of like fun fact article or a science book if your kids are in school about an animal that lives in an extreme environment, then like somewhere in the first list of fun facts about that animal will be, here is how it stays cool, or here is how it stays warm, right? Mm-hmm. The polar bear has all these layers of blubber and all this thick fur so that it can be in this really cold environment. The, I don't know, the like those little weird field mice that like live in deserts, like they have like these giant ears and, they retain very little body fat to help them stay cool, right? Like there's always kind of an implication that it's not, they can be in this environment because their standing body temperature is 125 degrees Fahrenheit, right? They can be in this temperature or in this environment because they have evolved a way for that environment to not raise their internal temperature above some healthy level. And so like because they're using the same proteins as us, I'm pretty sure, unless they got like secret proteins I don't know about, they also probably are within like a pretty close range across mammals. I mean, right? Like once you get to reptiles and birds and stuff, everything gets stupid.
Yep. And I double checked. Most mammals maintain a body temperature ranging from 97 to 103 degrees Fahrenheit. So.
Oh yeah. So a tiny little range.
Yeah. That's what I was just, because that's the thing is that when you start to run a really high fever, right? Like that's the thing that gets you is it's just kind of like, oh yeah, like your body is doing the genetic equivalent of dropping frag grenades in between you and the virus and saying, I wonder which one of us dies first, because it's like,
bet it's me. Hope it's me. Wait, you. Hope it's you. I don't know.
I don't know, man. I'm just going to keep cranking up this dial, which is also why, like, sometimes I know that they've said, like, be cognizant if you're trying to, like, artificially reduce your fever, because, like, it is potentially doing some good. And again, don't trust me on medical stuff. For the love of God, listen to your doctor and all that kind of stuff. But, is that you don't want your fever to get too high, because, then obviously it starts to kill you. But at the same point in time, it also makes it difficult for the bacteria and viruses to do their thing. But, so I thought that was really kind of cool that it's basically I always find fascination with, like, things that, humans, I think we are great at inventing stuff, right? Evidenced by the amount of stuff that we've invented, right? And in such a short amount of time. But sometimes I forget that, like, evolution has had millions to billions of years to work on stuff. So, like, it's pretty wild, some of the stuff that evolution's been able to make too. Because it's like, man, if we needed to make that, we'd have, like, a giant backpack with an AC unit on it and a bunch of, like, things hooked up into us, and, like, and a heater, so it's just like, oh, when it gets to this thing, now you need to switch the heating, and they're like, well, what if we made this, like, wool thing? That's kind of cool.
Yeah. I do have one more on the spot question for you. So a thing that is designed or has evolved to retain heat would be an insulator, right?
Mm-hmm.
So is there a word for a material that its function is to maintain, like, a homeostatic temperature?
Well, I think that it's something that is made to retain, to not interact well with its surroundings, is typically like an insulator.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Because it's broad, right? Because, like, you can have an electrical insulator, right? That doesn't, and then things that interact very well with their surroundings are conductors.
Conductors, yes.
So it's just kind of like, well, which is it? Is it an insulator or is it a conductor? It's kind of like one of those two things, because this one.
So something, I guess, that can function as both within a range.
Right. Yeah. So, like, you'd be like, oh, this thing's really cool because it becomes an insulator at this temperature and becomes a conductor at this temperature. That's super helpful because we want this thing to be in exactly this range. So if it starts to drop too low, we want it to be insulated. And if it starts to go too high, we want it to conduct, So
a conductolator,
an inseductor.
Yeah, neither of those are great.
Better. Nope.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm going to go think about it, and then I will come back with another question I want to ask you.